Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. William Desmond Taylor. A Hollywood tragedy in the silent era. On the morning of February 2nd, 1922, Los Angeles police officers arrived at a quaint bungalow in the Westlake district to find a scene of confusion and alarm. Inside the duplex at 404B South Alvarado Street lay the lifeless body of William Desmond Taylor, a prominent film director neatly sprawled on the living room floor. A crowd of Hollywood figures had already gathered, actors, actresses, and studio executives rifling through Taylor's belongings, searching for something amid the shock. A man identifying himself as a doctor briefly examined the 49-year-old director's body and declared a natural death, supposedly from a stomach hemorrhage. The mysterious doctor vanished before anyone could verify his credentials, and Taylor's friends began cleaning up the scene. Only when investigators rolled over the body did the truth reveal itself. William Desmond Taylor had been shot in the back at close range. A murder had occurred in the heart of Hollywood, and its reverberations would rattle the entire motion picture industry. The murder of William Desmond Taylor became an instant nationwide sensation, unfolding like a grim noir thriller amid the glamour of early Hollywood. Taylor was a well-respected director, a charming Anglo-Irish immigrant who had risen to prominence during the silent film era. News of his slaying, and the bizarre circumstances around it, flashed across headlines and captivated a scandal-hungry public. Here was a high-profile homicide with all the elements of drama. A beloved filmmaker dead under mysterious circumstances, rumors of love affairs with starlets, a household staff with shady pasts, and speculation of everything from drug revenge to occult involvement swirling in the tabloids. As more details emerged, the Taylor case became more than just an unsolved whodunit. It was a moral referendum on Hollywood itself. In the eyes of moral guardians across America, Taylor's death was proof of the film colony's depravity, coming on the heels of other scandals that suggested Tinseltown was a modern-day Babylon. Over a century later, the murder of William Desmond Taylor remains officially unsolved, Hollywood's most enduring cold case. But it is far from forgotten. The case has generated reams of investigative journalism, inspired books and films, and become enshrined in Hollywood lore. This episode will explore Taylor's life and career, and delve deeply into the world in which he lived and died. The booming early Hollywood of the 1910s, we will examine the social and cultural context of the era, from the freewheeling silent film industry and its notorious scandals, to the corruption within the Los Angeles Police Department that botched the investigation, to the frenzy media circus that both informed and misled the public. We'll profile the key figures in Taylor's orbit, including actress Mary Miles Minter, her domineering mother, Charlotte Shelby, and comedic star Mabel Normand. probing their psychological dimensions and possible motives. We will revisit the array of suspects in Fringe theories, from a long-lost valet and a deathbed confession to whispers of drug underworld vengeance and sexuality-driven extortion. We seek to paint a full portrait of William Desmond Taylor's world, the man he was, the Hollywood he inhabited, the forces that may have killed him, and the legacy of a murder that, even unsolved, managed to change Hollywood forever. Chapter 1: Early Life and Rise in Hollywood. William Desmond Taylor's path to Hollywood was as dramatic as any movie plot. He was born William Cunningham Dean Tanner on April 26, 1872, in Carlow, Ireland, into an Anglo-Irish family of modest privilege. His father was a former British Army officer, and Taylor enjoyed a gentleman's upbringing, attending Marlborough College in England as a teenager. Restless and imbued with wanderlust, he left Ireland in 1891 at age 18, after a falling out with his father, striking out for America. In the United States, the young expatriate sought adventure in the wide-open frontiers. He worked briefly on a dude ranch in Kansas, then traveled through Canada and Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, trying his hand at gold mining and various odd jobs. By the late 1890s, Taylor had gravitated to the bustling metropolis of New York City, where he found a position in an antiques business and rekindled an early love for the stage. In New York, William married Ethel May Hamilton, an actress, in 1901, and they had a daughter, Ethel Daisy, born the following year. But Taylor struggled with domestic life. He was known to drink heavily and suffer bouts of depression, and he reportedly had multiple affairs. On October 23, 1908, in a dramatic turn of events, he vanished, abandoning his wife and young child without a word. Friends speculated he might have suffered a mental lapse or amnesia. In reality, William Dean Tanner simply erased his old identity to start anew. Little is documented of the next few years of his life, but by 1912, he had reappeared under a new name, William Desmond Taylor, and a new vocation, acting in the fledgling motion picture industry. Taylor's arrival in Hollywood coincided with the rise of the American film industry and the westward shift of movie production. In the early 1910s, as filmmaking operations moved from New York and Chicago to Southern California's sunny, cheap real estate, Hollywood was transformed from a sleepy village into a world's film capital. Taylor was part of this migration. After some stage work and roadshow acting tours, he made his film debut around 1913. With his aristocratic bearing and resonant presence, Taylor found steady work in silent films, initially as an actor in dozens of short reels and features between 1913 and 1915. He soon transitioned to directing, where he truly made his mark. Over the rest of the decade, William Desmond Taylor directed more than 50 silent films, working with some of the era's biggest stars. Among his notable collaborators were Mary Pickford, America's Sweetheart, Dustin Farnham, Wallace Reid, and a young ingenue named Mary Miles Minter. By the late 1910s, Taylor had become a respected figure in Hollywood's close-knit community. Colleagues admired his intelligence and gentlemanly demeanor. He was elected president of the Motion Pictures Directors Association, reflecting the esteem he was held. Yet even as his professional life thrived, Taylor's personal life held shadows and secrets. In 1918, during World War I, he put his film career on hold to enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, serving in Europe with distinction and rising to the rank of major by war's end. Upon returning to Los Angeles in 1919, he was honored with a gala banquet by the film community. Not long after, his past unexpectedly caught up with him. Taylor's estranged wife and daughter, having seen him on screen in a movie, realized the famous director was the very man who had disappeared from their lives years before. In 1921, Taylor made amends by visiting his ex-wife in New York, informally providing for his daughter, making Ethel Daisy his legal heir. It was an intriguing chapter in Taylor's story, an abandoned identity, publicly revealed and partially reconciled. Yet, it barely dented his standing in Hollywood. To most who knew him in Los Angeles, William Desmond Taylor was regarded as a dignified bachelor with a refined air, fond of literature and art, and generous in his mentorship of younger industry colleagues. By 1922, Taylor was at the peak of his career. He had recently directed the popular actress Mary Miles Minter in the hit film Anne of Green Gables, 1919, cementing her rising stardom. He had also directed the beloved Mary Pickford in several successes. Taylor's bachelor lifestyle and urban charm made him a fixture in Hollywood social circles. He was particularly close with Mabel Normand, the leading comedy star of the day, known for her work with Charlie Chaplin and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. Taylor and Mabel shared an intellectual camaraderie. He would lend her books from his library, and they enjoyed long talks about art and philosophy. Despite whispers in fan magazines linking him romantically to both Mabel Normand and Mary Miles Minter, who was 30 years his junior, friends believed Taylor maintained proper boundaries. By most accounts, he treated Minter with a paternal gentleness and had even broken off a brief romantic flirtation with her due to their age difference. Minter, however, was besotted with Taylor and wasn't shy about showing it, much to her domineering mother's disapproval. In short, William Desmond Taylor in early 1922 was a man at the center of Hollywood's creative community, a war veteran, a cultured filmmaker, and a mentor to stars. He inhabited a rarefied world of silent-era glamour, but also one rife with excess and intrigue. To fully understand the forces that shaped his life and death, one must appreciate the broader backdrop of Hollywood's roaring early 1920s, a time of explosive growth, lavish lifestyles, lax morals, and intensifying public backlash. Chapter 2: Hollywood at the dawn of the 1920s. Taylor's career unfolded during a heady and transformative period for Hollywood. In the 1910s and early 1920s, the American motion picture industry grew from a novelty into a cultural juggernaut centered in the Los Angeles area. The studio system coalesced with giants like Paramount, MGM, Fox, and Warner Brothers, emerging and vertically integrating production, and distribution. The silent film was at its artistic apex, with grand historical epics, slapstick comedies, and star-driven melodramas drawing millions of viewers weekly to picture palaces across the nation. Hollywood was, as contemporaries said, booming. Along with that boom came an influx of people hungry for a shot at fame. Every week, new starstruck youth poured off trains into Los Angeles. The community was a volatile mix of creative ambition, money, and temptation. Life in Hollywood could be dazzling, but also grueling. For actors under contract, the studio enforced authoritarian control. Stars were tied to long-term exclusive contracts with moral clauses. Even before these were formalized, studio bosses exercised paternal oversight. They could be loaned out to other studios at will, and their public images were carefully stage-managed. Studios like Paramount, for whom Taylor worked, functioned as mini empires, with tight production schedules and factory-like output. Film shoots often ran from dawn till dusk. Crews labored long hours in primitive conditions, with hot lights and early sound stages that were stifling. Unions were nascent and often suppressed. Producers employed yellow dog contracts to forbid unionizing, and labor spies monitored dissension. Yet, for all the hardship, Hollywood offered glamour and high living for those who made it. Successful actors earned unprecedented salaries, and many spent those riches on a whirlwind lifestyle of parties, fast cars, mansions, and frequently illicit substances. Though the 1920s would later be nostalgically dubbed the Jazz Age, or the Roaring Twenties, for its spirit of liberation, it was also an era of social conservatism and legal strictures such as prohibition. The manufacture and sale of alcohol had been banned nationwide in 1920, but Hollywood was an island of indulgence. A popular quip was that film people publicly toasted prohibition, then secretly stocked their private bars. In fact, while outwardly supportive of prohibition, many successful actors spent their high wages on drugs and alcohol behind closed doors. Speakeasies flourished in Los Angeles, and champagne flowed freely at industry parties despite the law. Cocaine and opiates, though illegal, were not uncommon among certain stars, either as recreational thrills or misguided tonics to cope with the pressure of celebrity. Rising star Wallace Reed, a friend of Taylor's, had become tragically addicted to morphine, initially given for an injury, and by 1922 was wasting away. He would die early the next year, a high-profile drug death that further fanned calls for reform. Hollywood's hedonism did not go unnoticed by the broader American public. Local residents in Los Angeles sometimes resented the film colony's freewheeling ways. Some establishments even put up signs like "No dogs or actors allowed," reflecting a backlash against Hollywood eccentrics in their midst. Nationally, religious and civic leaders grew alarmed at the influence of movies on moral values. Scandalous stories from Hollywood provided perfect fodder for those who saw the film industry as a threat to the social order. Censorship battles preceded the 1910s. State legislature and city council were creating censorship board to review or ban films they found indecent. Early controversial films dealing with sexual innuendos, crime, or drug use drew protest. One notable crusader, Reverend Wilbur F. Crafts of the International Reform Bureau, railed against the sinful content of films and lobbied for federal regulation. But the industry lobbied back, and for a time Hollywood managed to police itself just enough to avoid outright government intervention. By 1921 to 1922, however, Hollywood's public image was reaching a crisis point. The accumulation of high-profile scandals suggested a pattern of lawlessness and moral laxity among movie folk. As Taylor's friend and fellow film director Marshall Neilan later quipped, Hollywood was getting a reputation as a modern Gomorrah. When Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, one of the most beloved comedians, was accused of raping a young actress who died after his wild party in September 1921, it unleashed a tsunami of public outrage. Church groups and newspapers howled that such debauchery by a film star proved the movies were corrupting the nation's youth. Arbuckle's trials, he was ultimately acquitted of manslaughter, were still underway when William Desmond Taylor's murder hit headlines in February 1922. The two scandals, arriving back to back, were intertwined in the public consciousness, reinforcing the notion that Hollywood was a hotbed of vice, whether it be sexual degeneracy, drugs, or now murder. Against this backdrop, Hollywood's power brokers knew they had to act to save the industry's reputation. In 1922, the studio heads, led by famous player Lasky's Adolf Zukor, hired Will H. Hayes, a former U.S. Postmaster General with impeccable conservative credentials, to head a new trade organization and serve as a moral czar for the movies. Hayes' mission was to clean up Hollywood's image and stave off government censorship by enforcing a code of conduct. This was the birth of what would become the Hayes Code a decade later. Every weapon of PR was to be used to show the public that Hollywood could reform itself. It's within this charged climate, booming artistic creativity on one hand and growing scandal on the other, that the murder of William Desmond Taylor occurred. The case would not only embody the era's excesses in the public mind, but directly accelerate Hollywood's attempts at self-censorship and image management. Before diving into the complex investigation and suspects, let us recount the events of the fateful night itself and the discovery of the crime, as those details are crucial in understanding how the mystery unfolded and why it remains so tantalizing. Chapter 3. The Fateful Night. William Desmond Taylor spent Wednesday, February 1st, 1922, much like any other day, unaware of his approaching fate. He worked at the studio in the morning and afternoon, then in the early evening returned home to his bungalow at the Alvarado Court Apartments, a small complex of single-story dwellings set around a courtyard. Taylor's home was a stylish but not ostentatious bachelor pad, filled with books, paintings, and comfortable furnishings that reflected his refined taste. He lived alone, but employed a cook and a valet, a 27-year-old man named Henry Peavy, who handled domestic chores. Peavy had replaced Taylor's previous valet, Edward Sands, who had mysteriously quit months earlier after betraying Taylor's trust, but more on that later. That evening, sometime around 7 p.m., Taylor had a visit from a close friend, actress Mabel Normand. Mabel was one of the top comedic stars of the day, vivacious, sharp-witted, and at 28, still youthful. She and Taylor enjoyed a platonic friendship bonded over literature and mutual respect. Mabel dropped by Taylor's bungalow to pick up a book he had recommended, reportedly a volume of Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, an insight into the intellectual interests they shared. They sat and chatted warmly for a little while. According to Mabel's later account, Taylor was in good spirits, but mentioned he was bothered by something related to his former valet, Edward Sands, who had forged Taylor's checks and stolen from him the previous year. Taylor also expressed mild concern about Henry Peavy, who had needed bailing out of jail recently after an arrest for a minor offense. Peavy had been arrested days earlier for social vagrancy, essentially a euphemism often used for homosexual solicitation, which embarrassed Taylor, but he remained loyal to his employee. Around 7:45 p.m., Mabel Normand said goodnight to Taylor. Outside, she blew him a playful kiss as she departed, and Taylor watched her go with a fond smile. This farewell was witnessed by Taylor's neighbor across the courtyard, making Mabel the last known person to see Taylor alive. Moments later, sometime close to 8 p.m., neighbors heard what might have been a loud pop sound. Some assumed it was a car backfiring, not realizing it was likely the gunshot that ended Taylor's life. It appears Taylor was shot very soon after Mabel left, possibly within minutes. The assailant would have either already been inside the bungalow or entered through the unlocked front door, catching Taylor by surprise. The fatal shot struck him in the back, at the base of the neck, severing vital arteries. Taylor likely died within seconds, collapsing onto the floor face up. Despite the proximity of neighbors, no one immediately called the police. The sound did not arouse alarm initially, and Taylor's body lay undiscovered through the night. The next morning, February 2nd, at around 7:30 a.m., Henry Peavy arrived as usual to prepare Taylor's breakfast. Instead, Peavy found his employer lying cold on the living room floor. Panicked, Peavy ran out into the courtyard, shouting for help. Neighbors gathered, and in the chaotic minutes that followed, someone identifying himself as a doctor stepped forward from the small crowd to examine Taylor. After a cursory look, this supposed physician pronounced that Taylor had died of a stomach hemorrhage, perhaps fooled by the absence of immediate blood evidence. The entry wound was small and in the back, unseen by those who hadn't moved the body. At this news, initial relief may have spread among the assembled friends. Their dear friend had died apparently of natural causes, not foul play. What happened next would become one of the most criticized aspects of the case: the delay in alerting the authorities and the contamination of the crime scene. Believing, or perhaps wanting to believe, that no crime had occurred, several of the movie colony folks present began tidying up the bungalow, Some call Taylor studio bosses. It is widely reported that Paramount executives arrived and rifled through Taylor's papers and belongings before police ever saw the scene. According to one vivid account, when two LAPD officers finally showed up, reportedly on bicycles responding to a belated report of a natural death, they barged into what looked like a small cocktail party. A Paramount producer was cleaning dishes in the kitchen, an actress was searching through drawers, and an extra, a bit player, was seen walking out the front door with a case of Taylor's bootlegged gin. The officers quickly realized something was very wrong. They cleared the room and turned Taylor's body over. Only then did the bullet wound become apparent, with a crimson stain and powder burns on his vest, revealing that he had been shot at close range. The physician who gave the hemorrhage diagnosis was nowhere to be found again. Some suspected he was not a real doctor at all, just a passerby who made an erroneous pronouncement and melted away. Once the reality set in that William Desmond Taylor had been murdered, the Los Angeles Police Department mobilized an investigation. Detectives and the coroner arrived, though precious hours had been lost and the crime scene hopelessly compromised. The coroner noted the single gunshot wound and later determined the bullet was a .38 caliber slug that had lodged in Taylor's body. No firearm was found in the house. Oddly, certain personal items remain untouched. On Taylor's person were found cash amounting to $78, a significant sum in 1922, equal to about $1,400 today. A silver cigarette case, a pocket watch, a penknife, and a gold locket containing a photo of Mabel Normand. A 2-carat diamond ring sparkled on his finger. These valuables being left behind indicated that robbery was not the motive, or at least not the primary one. However, other items were noted as missing or out of place. Taylor's accountant later reported that the director had shown him a large amount of cash the day before, money that was now gone and never accounted for. Also, investigators discovered in an upstairs dresser some love letters written to Taylor by Mary Miles Minter, the 19-year-old starlet he had directed and who was widely rumored to be infatuated with him. One letter, scrawled in schoolgirl violet ink, addressed Taylor as "my own blessed darling baby," Minter's pet name for him, and professed her eternal love. Even a pink silk nightgown monogrammed with Mary's initial was allegedly found in Taylor's bedroom, a potentially scandalous detail leaked to the press. Within hours, the press indeed got wind that a famous director had been slain, and they descended en masse. The coroner's inquest was held only a few days later, on February 4th, and 5 witnesses gave brief public testimony, mainly establishing the timeline and circumstances of the body's discovery. The inquest jurors promptly ruled the death a homicide by person or persons unknown, and the case then fully moved into the hands of the LAPD detectives in the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. Little did anyone know that the Taylor murder investigation would become one of the most notorious, bungled, and politically charged probes in the city's history. Chapter 4: The Bungled Investigation in LAPD Corruption. From the outset, the LAPD handling of William Desmond Taylor's case was marred by missteps, controversy, and the strong odor of corruption. In fairness, the sheer frenzy surrounding the case would have challenged even the most capable detectives. Taylor's murder became a media circus, with newspapers, especially the sensationalist Hertz Press, scrutinizing every rumor and lambasting the police for lack of progress. But beyond the press pressure, internal failures plagued the investigation. One glaring initial blunder was the failure to secure the crime scene. By the time proper police investigators arrived on the morning of February 2nd, a number of Taylor's industry friends and colleagues had trampled through the bungalow, possibly removing or altering evidence in their attempt to protect Taylor's reputation and the studio's interests. It was later confirmed that Paramount's Western studio manager, Charles Eighton, had gathered up papers and letters from Taylor's home, allegedly to avoid scandal, such as the Mary Minter letters becoming public. Tampering aside, the police made their own errors. They initially treated some witnesses with kid gloves, perhaps due to their celebrity status or political influence. And crucially, early leads were not aggressively followed, giving suspects time to flee or cover their tracks. Within days, LAPD Captain David Adams and Detective Edward King were leading the case under intense spotlight. Yet, a cloud of suspicion soon hung over the department's commitment. Anecdotes from those involved later suggested that high-ranking officials were keen to contain the scandal, not necessarily to solve it at any cost. King Vidor, a film director who decades later conducted his own private inquiry, recounted that a detective told him the police work had been deliberately stifled. "We were doing all right, and then, before a week was out, we got the word to lay off." In other words, someone with clout had ordered the case to be toned down. This astonishing claim, if true, implies an organized cover-up to protect either a particular suspect or the broader interests of Hollywood. In 1922, the film industry's economic power in Los Angeles was already significant, and studio bosses had cozy relationships with city officials. It is entirely plausible that pressure was exerted on the LAPD and the district attorney to not dig too deeply if the trail led toward an embarrassing culprit. Certainly, some evidence mysteriously vanished from police custody over time. A fingerprinted item, said to be a 2-volume set of Shakespeare found at the scene, disappeared from the files. Key physical evidence, like the precise bullet that killed Taylor, was not preserved. The slug was taken from Taylor's body during autopsy, but by some accounts it was later lost or misplaced. At least one LAPD officer, Eddie King, was caught leaking information to the press, which might have been an attempt to smoke out leads, or could have been in exchange for kickbacks from eager tabloids. The investigation stretched on without an arrest, and public criticism mounted. Los Angeles was no stranger to police corruption. In the 1910s and 1920s, saw the LAPD frequently accused of bribery, protecting organized crime, and being in the pocket of politicians. In Taylor's case, Suspicion of interference focused on the office of the district attorney. The DA in early 1922 was Thomas Lee Woolwine, a man with political ambitions and known connections. It later emerged that Woolwine was a social acquaintance of none other than Charlotte Shelby, Mary Miles Minter's mother, and a growing suspect in Taylor's murder. Woolwine had faced bribery accusations himself some years before. Could he be trusted to pursue the case objectively if it pointed toward his friend? Records indicate that Charlotte Shelby was never indicted or arrested, despite quite damning circumstantial evidence, which we will detail in the next section. Decades later, it came to light that Shelby may have bribed officials to avoid prosecution. An accountant who worked for Shelby testified in a 1930s lawsuit that huge sums, up to $750,000, were withdrawn from Shelby's accounts and converted into untraceable bonds starting in 1922. The implication was that this fortune greased palms at various levels, possibly the DA's office, the police, even press reporters, to ensure the Taylor's case stayed muddled and unprosecuted. It's an astonishing figure, equivalent to over $11 million today, and if true, demonstrates the lengths to which a wealthy suspect might go to escape justice. The police did pursue other leads at the time, but often in a haphazard way. For example, they initially hunted for Taylor's former valet, Edward Sands, thinking he might have had a revenge motive. However, Sands had vanished without a trace, and it's unclear if the LAPD ever got close to finding him. They also interrogated Henry Peavy, Taylor's current valet, who found the body. Peavy was an easy target for sensational press due to his arrest record and flamboyant demeanor. After harsh questioning, police cleared Peavy as the murderer, but one crafty reporter wasn't convinced. In a bizarre episode, New York reporter Floribel Muir tried to scare Peavy into confessing by arranging a nighttime stunt. She had Confederates dress as Taylor's ghost at the cemetery and accost Peavy, hoping he'd blurt out guilt. The plan backfired. Peavy merely laughed and swore at them. This anecdote, while darkly comic, highlighted the circus-like atmosphere around the case. Journalists, not just police, were trying to solve, or sensationalize, the murder by any means necessary. Frustrated by the lack of an arrest, the Los Angeles County Grand Jury convened on March 1922 to review the evidence. But nothing definitive came of it at the time. The case went somewhat cold after a few months, even as the media continued to print rumors. Then, 5 years later in 1927, a new district attorney reopened the Taylor investigation amid public clamor that the killer had gotten away. Again in 1937, the case was revived, spurred by fresh statements made during civil litigation within the Shelby family. Each time, tantalizing hints of new evidence emerged. For instance, a 1937 grand jury heard from Margaret Shelby, Mary's sister, that she had long protected her mother regarding Taylor's murder. Despite such leads, prosecutors demurred. In 1938, the then D.A. Baron Fitz, himself later indicted for bribery in unrelated matters, announced there was insufficient evidence to indict Charlotte Shelby. Notably, Fitz had at one point gathered all the secret files and testimony on the case and stored them in a safe, but those files disappeared permanently in the 1940s. The LAPD investigation was hampered by a combination of incompetence and likely corruption. One contemporary deputy, speaking in 1922, lamented how the case had hurt law enforcement credibility. The industry has been hurt. Stars have been ruined. A lot of people are out of jobs and incensed enough to take a shot at you. Los Angeles Undersheriff Eugene Biscalas warned a reporter, reflecting the volatile mix of economic fallout and anger swirling around the unsolved murder. Hollywood's own interests were paradoxically both served and damaged by the failure to solve the crime. On one hand, avoiding a scandalous trial that might ensnare a famous actress or reveal lurid details was seen as necessary to protect the film industry's image. On the other, the mystery's very lack of closure allowed wild speculations to flourish, arguably feeding the perception of Hollywood as a den of iniquity where murderers walked free. In public, studio declared full cooperation with authorities, but privately, they breathed a sigh of relief that the more inconvenient truths were buried with Taylor or suppressed by compliant officials. The stage was thus set for a gallery of suspects to be tried in the court of public opinion. In the next sections, we will examine the primary figures whose lives became entangled with Taylor's death and explore their psyche, motives, and fates. Chapter 5. Charlotte Shelby. Of all the people implicated in William Desmond Taylor's murder, none cast a shadow as long as Charlotte Shelby. She was the classic stage mother, flamboyant, possessive, and fiercely protective of her daughter, the actress Mary Miles Minter. In the years before and after Taylor's death, Charlotte Shelby emerged as the most widely suspected perpetrator, so much so that both contemporary observers and later researchers have often zeroed in on her as the likely killer. Understanding Shelby's character and her relationship with Mary is key to evaluating this theory. Charlotte Shelby was born Lily Pearl Miles, a failed actress herself. She funneled her thwarted ambitions into her daughters. Mary Miles Minter, born Juliet Riley in 1902, was Shelby's younger daughter and golden child. Under Charlotte's astute, if ruthless, management, Mary became a successful film star in her teens, marketed as a sweet, virginal ingenue. Shelby was described by those who knew her as manipulative, domineering, and consumed by wanton greed over her daughter's career. She had lied about Mary's age to skirt child labor laws, passing off 11-year-old Mary as 16-year-old by using a dead cousin's identity. And she tightly controlled Mary's contracts, finances, and personal life. Mary's earnings, which were substantial by 1922, flowed into bank accounts managed by Charlotte, a bone of contention that would later erupt into lawsuits. When Mary Miles Minter co-starred in films directed by William Desmond Taylor, notably Anne of Green Gables in 1919, she developed a powerful crush on the sophisticated director, 2 decades her senior. Taylor seemed to be fond of Mary, but reportedly maintained a proper distance, aware of her youth and perhaps wary of her mother. Mary, however, declared her love openly, writing him ardent letters, and even, it was said, sneaking out of her house to visit him. According to later accounts, Mary would slip away late at night while her mother slept to steal moments with Taylor, throwing herself at him in puppy love fashion. Taylor, always the gentleman, gently tried to dissuade her, allegedly telling Mary he was old enough to be her father. This clandestine relationship, whether it was consummated or remained chaste, enraged Charlotte Shelby. To Charlotte, a middle-aged man seducing her teenage meal ticket was an existential threat. Shelby was known to have a volatile temper and was not above brandishing firearms to make a point. In fact, she owned a rare .38 caliber revolver, unusual bullets and all, which would become chillingly relevant when Taylor was shot by a very similar .38 caliber round. Charlotte's ferocity in guarding Mary's virtue and career had manifested before. A couple of years earlier, Mary had been involved with another older man, director James Kirkwood, and allegedly became pregnant as a result. Charlotte arranged for an abortion and, as rumor has it, threatened Kirkwood at gunpoint to stay away from her daughter. She even burst onto a film set with a pistol in hand when she heard Mary was getting too close to a co-star, the actor Monty Blue. These episodes paint a portrait of a woman who would literally pull the trigger to defend what she saw as her property, Mary. In 1920, as mentioned in one account, Charlotte Shelby actually showed up at Taylor's bungalow late one night with her 1912 .38 revolver hidden in her sleeve, demanding to know if Mary was with him. That time Mary was not there, and the incident passed without violence. Fast forward to the night of Taylor's murder. We know Mary was rumored to have visited Taylor's home that evening, though she denied it, claiming her last meeting with him was in December 1921. But in later years, a startling narrative emerged. In Mary's unpublished memoir and other private papers, which surfaced when her estate was settled in the 1980s, she apparently admitted that she and her mother were indeed at Taylor's bungalow the night of the killing. King Vidor, investigating in the 1960s, heard that Mary had ambiguously confessed something similar to him, essentially implicating her mother. The scenario that fits those revelations is dramatic. Mary slipped out to see Taylor that night after Mabel Normand left. Charlotte discovered Mary missing, grabbed her pistol, and followed her to Taylor's. There she found her daughter in an intimate situation with Taylor, and in a fit of rage shot him. This theory, often called the Charlotte Shelby did it theory, aligns with Charlotte's established behavior patterns, extreme jealousy, and readiness to use a gun, and with much of the available circumstantial evidence. Consider that Charlotte's initial statements to police were evasive and filled with lies, especially about Mary's relationship with Taylor. She tried to downplay any connection. Shelby also owned that rare .38 caliber pistol with unusual soft-nosed bullets essentially identical to the one that killed Taylor. When press reports publicized that fact, Charlotte reportedly dumped the gun. She had her mother, Mary's grandmother, toss the weapon into a Louisiana bayou in the summer of 1922. Furthermore, Charlotte's alibi for the night of February 1st was dubious. She claimed to have been with a friend, the actor Carl Stockdale, throughout the evening. Stockdale indeed backed her up, but years later, it emerged that Charlotte paid Carl Stockdale a hefty stipend for life, about $200 per month. That lifetime income smells like hush money for perjury. In 1937, when the case was re-examined, Shelby went so far as to insist on testifying to clear her name, after her other daughter, Margaret, accused her openly of murder in a drunken fit. During the grand jury hearing, Margaret Fillmore stated that on the night of the murder, her mother was not at home as she should have been, and that Charlotte had been afraid Mary might run off with Taylor. In that closed session, Detective Lieutenant Ed Sanderson also testified that an unfired bullet of the same unique type as the fatal one was later found hidden in the rafters of the Shelby family home, left over from a prior incident where Mary had staged a melodramatic fake suicide with her mother's gun. All these pieces strengthened the case that Charlotte Shelby had both means and motive to kill Taylor, and quite possibly did. Why then was Charlotte Shelby never prosecuted? The answer circles back to the corruption issue. It was commonly whispered that Charlotte had the law in her pocket. Indeed, at least 2 Los Angeles County District Attorneys declined to charge her, publicly citing insufficient evidence. The closest call came in the late 1930s, when the accumulated evidence was reviewed. DA Burren Fitz basically admitted she was the prime suspect, but said they couldn't make the case stick after so much time. Additionally, the fact that Mary Miles' mentor, the person Shelby supposedly was protecting, never believed or admitted her mother did it in public, made the situation murky. Mary and her mother had a falling out in the mid-1920s. Over money, Mary sued Charlotte in 1925 for misappropriating her earnings, but they later reconciled. Mary always maintained, at least outwardly, that her mother was innocent of the murder. One can only imagine the psychological knots Mary must have tied herself in, if indeed she knew her mother was guilty. Charlotte Shelby lived until 1957, never facing legal consequences. The Taylor case trailed her all her life. Reportedly, she suffered paranoia, fearing indictment even in her final years. But she died free. The Los Angeles Times once noted that Shelby feared being tried for the murder, yet the truth was buried with William Desmond Taylor when Hollywood closed ranks. In evaluating Charlotte Shelby, one senses a larger-than-life personality, shaped by the fierce love and opportunism of a stage mom. The Moors of the Old South, as she was from Louisiana, and the high stakes of Hollywood stardom. If she did kill Taylor, it was likely in an impulsive moment of protective rage, rather than premeditated malice. Ironically, by destroying Taylor, she also destroyed her daughter's career and happiness, the very thing she was trying to safeguard. Chapter 6. Mary Miles' Mentor. In the tragedy of William Desmond Taylor, Mary Miles' mentor occupies a role akin to a classic film ingenue whose life takes a disastrous turn. Once a sparkling young star compared to Mary Pickford, Mary Miles' mentor's brush with scandal from Taylor's murder effectively ended her film career and cast a pall over her life. Understanding Mary's psychology requires peeling back the layers of her stardom, her fraught relationship with her mother, and the unrequited love she harbored for Taylor. Mary was just 19 at the time of Taylor's death, though she had been working in show business for over a decade. With delicate features, blonde curls, and a demure on-screen persona, she was groomed to be a sweet innocent of silent screen. But off-screen, Mary's life was anything but innocent or simple. Under Charlotte Shelby's tight control, Mary had little teenage freedom. She often acted out in what limited ways she could. Her infatuation with William Desmond Taylor appears to have been one part genuine love and one part adolescent rebellion, falling for a man who offered her kindness, intellectual respect, and an escape, however platonic, from her mother's clutches. By many accounts, Mary practically worshipped Taylor. On set, she was attentive to his direction and found excuses to be near him. She wrote him tender, if overly effusive, letters, addressing him as darlingest and blessed baby, and signing off with girlish endearments. Some of these letters came to light when investigators found them among Taylor's effects. The press had a field day. It was titillating news that a teenage star had been in love with the murdered director. In fact, the Los Angeles Examiner, a Hertz paper, published excerpts of Mary's love notes, including one where she declared, "I love you, I love you, I love you," presumably to dramatize the rose petal romance angle of the crime. Mary's image as a virginal girl next door was tarnished by innuendo that she might have been sexually involved with Taylor. The revelation that her monogrammed silk lingerie was found in his home only added fuel to the fire. Although there's no concrete evidence Mary and Taylor's relationship was sexual, the public perceived it as scandalous. It was, in effect, an early prototype of a media narrative that would recur in Hollywood: the fallen angel starlet, scorched by forbidden love. Mary's own statement during the investigation were somewhat naive and telling. She denied visiting Taylor on the fatal night, insisting the last time she saw him was Christmas 1921. But she admitted to being in love with him. She even told police that a few weeks before the murder, mutual friend Marsha O'Neillan had warned her that Taylor seemed to be speaking oddly, making delusional comments about people, and that perhaps he had gone a bit insane. This odd claim that Taylor was possibly mentally unstable might have been Mary trying to process the shock, or perhaps planting a hint that if Taylor had enemies, he had imagined them. It didn't carry much weight in the probe. After Taylor's murder, Mary Miles' mentor had a swift fall from grace. Though never charged with anything, she was hounded by the press as an object of morbid curiosity. Public opinion, swayed by sensational journalism, cast her alternately as a heartbroken victim and a possible accomplice or instigator. Hollywood, ever pragmatic, saw her as tainted goods, someone whose very name now evoked lurid scandal. She completed a few films that were already in production, but by 1923, her studio Paramount quietly let her contract lapsed. Offers dried up. Mary felt, with some justification, that she had been made a scapegoat. My career was blasted and my private life ruined, she reflected bitterly 15 years later. In a 1937 interview, Mary said, "Shadows have been cast upon my reputation. I demand that I either be prosecuted or exonerated." It was a cry of frustration. She wanted an official resolution to lift the cloud of suspicion that had lingered over her youth. No such resolution came. Meanwhile, Mary's relationship with her mother deteriorated post-scandal. In 1925, she sued Charlotte Shelby for an accounting of all the money she had earned as a child star, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, because Charlotte was hoarding it. The lawsuit was ugly and public, revealing how Mary had been kept financially dependent. Mary reportedly even threatened to expose what she believed her mother had done. However, Charlotte and Mary settled their monetary dispute quietly after a few years, and they reconciled to some degree. Possibly Mary, deep down, could not fully accept that her mother killed the man she loved. Or, if she did accept it, she chose familial loyalty in silence. It's also worth noting that Mary's own sister Margaret, who had initially backed Charlotte's alibi, later reversed and accused their mother of murder out loud in 1938, though Margaret's credibility was undermined by her struggles with alcoholism and mental illness. Mary was mortified by her sister's public outburst. Through it all, Mary steadfastly defended her mother in public. Her stance was, if authorities think Mother or I did this, then why have they not charged us? This allowed Mary to play the part of unjustly ruined innocent, which indeed she was in the eyes of many fans. Mary Miles Mentor lived a long, largely reclusive life after Hollywood cast her out. In the decades that followed, she made a few attempts at comebacks or public reappearances, a rumored Broadway try, some interviews, but nothing took. She had short-lived romances, an engagement to a New York critic in the 1920s, marriage in the 1950s to a real estate man, but no children. In 1981, in a strange coda, the elderly Mary was beaten and robbed in her own home by burglars, one of whom was a former live-in companion, a traumatic epilogue to her storied life. She died in 1984, at age 82. Her ashes scattered at sea, perhaps a gentle anonymity that she might have preferred after decades of infamy. Psychologically, one might read Mary as a tragic figure who never escaped the long shadow of her early fame in the Taylor case. In her youth, she was vivacious, talented, and genuinely in love, yet utterly under her mother's thumb, and ultimately powerless in the face of fate. After the tragedy, she oscillated between bitterness and nostalgia. In a 1970 audio interview, her last known public statement on the matter, Mary still professed love for Taylor and sorrow for what happened, while denouncing the newspapers that she felt had destroyed her without cause. It is not hard to imagine that Mary's psyche was scarred by a potent mix of guilt, survivor's guilt or guilt if she felt she'd set events in motion, grief for Taylor, and anger at her mother in Hollywood. She wanted to be remembered for her art, not her scandal. All we can do is speculate and remember Mentor for her talent, a biographer wrote in summing up her life. Indeed, Mary's films, those that survived, show a luminous, charming actress, but history largely remembers her as a supporting player in the saga of a murder, a role she never auditioned for but couldn't escape. Chapter 7. Mabel Normand. While Mary Miles' mentor became a scandal's casualty, Mabel Normand had the misfortune of being drawn into the Taylor case at the worst possible time for her already fragile career. Mabel was in many ways an opposite figure to Mary, not an ingenue, but a seasoned star, not sheltered, but rather an independent, wisecracking woman known as the Queen of Comedy. By 1922, Mabel Normand was Hollywood royalty, famed for her work in Mack Sennett's Keystone comedies, and one of the first women to direct films as well. She was vivacious, carefree, and had a notoriously robust appetite for fun. However, behind the laughter, Mabel struggled with personal demons, including a dependency on cocaine that was an open secret in the industry. Mabel and William Desmond Taylor shared a genuine bond. Taylor admired Mabel's talent and cared about her well-being. Some accounts say he was helping her to quit drugs. He even footed the bill to send her to a sanitarium for treatment. Whether purely platonic or slightly romantic, their relationship was one of mutual respect. Taylor was like a protective older brother or confidant to Mabel, and they often spent evenings together chatting about books. When Taylor was murdered just minutes after Mabel left his home, it was inevitable that suspicion would glance in her direction. After all, she was the last person to see him alive. Police questioned her extensively, and although nothing implicated Mabel in the crime beyond timing, the tabloids were merciless. In the public imagination, fueled by Hertz Examiner and others, Mabel Normand became an object of morbid fascination. The coke-addled star whose presence at a murder scene made her suspect. Some newspapers insinuated that Mabel's underworld drug connections might somehow tie to Taylor's death, perhaps vengeful dope dealer targeting Taylor for meddling in Mabel's habits. This theory had Taylor essentially killed as collateral damage in the drug wars, which we will revisit later. Others printed wild stories hinting Mabel knew more than she told, or that jealousy involving Mabel, Mary, and Taylor formed a love triangle motive. In reality, the police never considered Mabel Normand a serious suspect. She had a firm alibi after she left Taylor's bungalow, and no evidence of animosity toward Taylor at all. If anything, she was deeply shaken by his death. Yet, her career suffered terribly from the mere association. Taylor's murder came on the heels of the Arbuckle affair, September 1921, which had already put Hollywood on thin ice with the public. Mack Sennett, Mabel's mentor, was just about to release a big comeback film for her, Molly O, in hopes of distancing her from Arbuckle's mess, since she had worked so closely with him. Then, the Taylor scandal dragged Mabel into another quagmire. Conservative voices latched on to her presence in the case as proof of Hollywood women's depravity. She was painted as a drug-abusing libertine. Editorials of the day envied that the likes of Mabel Normand were emblematic of filmdom's moral rot, citing her, along with Taylor, as examples of Hollywood Babylon. For instance, anti-Hollywood editorials explicitly invoked Taylor's murder to decry the movie colony as our American Sodom and Gomorrah, urging a crackdown. In the immediate aftermath, though not charged, Mabel retreated from the public eye for a short while. Reports mentioned she was sent to a sanatorium to recover from tuberculosis and later died, compressing the timeline a bit. Actually, Mabel Normand did continue to work intermittently through the 1920s, but her reputation never fully recovered. On New Year's Day 1924, misfortune struck again. Mabel was involved in another notorious incident, the shooting of her wealthy lover, Cortland Dines, by Mabel's chauffeur. The chauffeur turned out to be an escaped criminal who inexplicably fired Dines' gun at him during a drunken gathering. The reason remained unclear, but Mabel was present. Although Mabel was innocent in that case too, the press now had two violent scandals attached to her name. Many theaters pulled her films, and moral crusaders cited her as an example of Hollywood degeneracy. A combination of declining health and the toxicity of her image led Mabel's early exit from the industry. By 1926, she made her last feature. On February 23, 1930, Mabel Normand died of tuberculosis at age 37, her body worn out by illness and perhaps the hard living of earlier years. Mabel's personal downfall is one of the saddest collateral damages of the Taylor murder saga. A remarkably gifted comedian who should have been celebrated for her work. Instead, she found herself stigmatized. Mack Sennett, who loved her in his own way, lamented that Mabel's name was dragged through the mud unfairly. Some film historians posit that had Taylor not been killed, or had Mabel not been connected to it, she might have navigated the 1920s with her career intact long enough to transition into talkies, or at least to retire more gracefully. In a poignant interview not long before her death, Mabel said, "I never hold a grudge. Life is too short." It was a reflective comment that perhaps alluded to the troubles and false accusations she had endured. She tried to maintain dignity and humor to the very end. The mythology around Taylor's case often unfairly cast Mabel Normand as a tragic, perhaps tarnished figure, when in truth she was mostly a victim of circumstance, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her only crime was being an independent woman in an era unforgiving to women who strayed from Victorian ideals, caught up in a scandal that had nothing to do with her actions. In the grand saga, Mabel becomes a symbol of how Hollywood's early scandals could destroy lives that weren't even truly guilty. A silent victim, as one Guardian article aptly called her. Chapter 8. Other Suspects in Fringe Theories. While the spotlight of suspicion settled on Charlotte Shelby, and briefly on Mary Minter and Mabel Normand by association, the William Desmond Taylor case generated a rogues gallery of secondary suspects and wild theories over the years. The combination of a botched investigation and rampant tabloid speculation left the mystery wide open, inviting armchair detectives and true crime enthusiasts to propose alternative culprits. Here, we explore some of the most discussed figures and hypotheses. Edward F. Sands, aka Edward Fitz Strathmore. Taylor's former valet and cook, Sands, is often cited as a prime suspect, especially in early accounts. A cunning and unscrupulous character, Sands had prior convictions for embezzlement and forgery. While Taylor was in Europe in mid-1921, Sands betrayed his employer by forging Taylor's name on checks stealing funds, and even crashing Taylor's car for joyride kicks. Sands then brazenly burglarized Taylor's bungalow, leaving footprints on Taylor's bed as a calling card. By the time Taylor returned to California, Sands had vanished, only to send mocking, taunting letters later. So when Taylor was shot, many thought Sands might have done it out of revenge or fear of retribution. Sands had the skill of a sneak thief and presumably could slip in and out quietly. Yet, certain factors cast doubt. Would Sands kill Taylor over relatively petty grievances like theft? And if he did, why leave valuables on the body and not stage a burglary? Regardless, the police wanted very much to find Sands, if only to eliminate him as a suspect. But Edward Sands disappeared completely after the murder. Despite nationwide leads, some tips placed him as far as Europe or the South Seas. He was never located. His complete vanishing act itself fueled conspiracy theories. Perhaps someone paid Sands to disappear, or perhaps Sands was the killer and successfully covered his tracks. Some modern theorists lean towards Sands as the likeliest suspect, simply because he had motive, avoiding jail for his earlier crimes, and opportunity. And he was never heard from again, which could mean he skipped the country right after pulling the trigger. Still, without a shred of direct evidence placing him at the scene, Sands remained an enigma, an attractive suspect largely by process of elimination rather than proof. Henry Peavy. Taylor's replacement valet, Peavy was the one who found the body. The press, playing to racist tropes of the time, as Peavy was African American, initially tried to make something of Peavy's eccentricities, such as his penchant for flashy clothes and his recent arrest for lewd conduct in a park, which implied a homosexual liaison. However, police interrogated Peavy thoroughly and ruled him out. He had a rock-solid alibi, being seen at a nearby drugstore around the likely time of death. Peavy's possible motive was non-existent. He had no grievance against his kind employer, and he hadn't been in service long enough for deeper drama. The only ongoing suspicion involving Peavy came from a sensational quarter. New York Daily News reporter Floribel Muir, in her bid for a scoop, latched on to Peavy and orchestrated the aforementioned ghost prank at the cemetery to scare a confession out of him. The stunt, failing spectacularly, only underlined that Peavy had nothing to confess. Besides, as Muir miscalculated, Taylor spoke with a British accent, which the fake ghost did not replicate, giving the ruse away. Tragically, Henry Peavy's life after the murder was short. He died about a decade later in a state hospital, suffering from syphilis-related dementia. In death, he too was exonerated by history's judgment, remembered mostly as a footnote, the poor man who had the misfortune of stumbling onto a Hollywood horror. Margaret Gibson, or Patricia Palmer. The tale of Margaret Gibson adds a noir twist to the roster of suspects. Gibson was a silent film actress who had a minor connection to Taylor. They had acted together in at least one film years earlier, around 1910. Gibson's career was lackluster and marred by scandal. She was even arrested in 1917 on charges related to prostitution and extortion, though acquitted. After Taylor's murder, Gibson faded into obscurity, living abroad for many years. Then, in 1964, in her late 70s and near death, Margaret Gibson reportedly confessed on her deathbed, "I killed William Desmond Taylor." This startling declaration made in the presence of a priest and neighbors, did not come with details, but it caused a sensation when revealed. Could Gibson really have been the killer? If so, what was her motive? One theory suggests Gibson was in love with Taylor and killed him out of jealousy, perhaps over Mabel Normand, or because of a perceived betrayal. Another theory posits Gibson was involved in the Los Angeles underworld and might have had a hand in the blackmail scheme targeting Taylor, possibly related to his rumored bisexuality, and things turned violent. There's also speculation she knew Edward Sands. Some sources claim Sands and Gibson might have been acquainted in the criminal demi-monde, though this is tenuous. Unfortunately, Gibson's confession, lacking specifics, remains an intriguing but uncorroborated claim. Some discount it as an old woman's ramblings seeking attention or absolution. Yet, the notion that a peripheral Hollywood figure might have harbored an obsessive grudge and seized an opportunity to kill Taylor isn't entirely implausible. Gibson's confession has fueled recent podcasts and articles, renewing interest in this nearly forgotten actress who wanted the spotlight, even if only as a self-proclaimed murderer at the very end of her life. The drug syndicate theory. One sensational hypothesis that circulated, particularly in East Coast papers and via at least one ambitious federal official, was that Taylor was assassinated by an international dope ring. The idea was that by helping Mabel Normand get clean and cooperating with authorities against narcotic suppliers, Taylor angered powerful drug dealers who sent a hitman to silence him. Indeed, Taylor had been vocally anti-drug. He gave speeches at the studio urging colleagues to avoid the dope evil, especially after seeing Wallace Reed's decline. However, this theory, while cinematic, lacks hard evidence. It was notably championed by a Washington, D.C. figure, a would-be politician, looking to make a name crusading against vice. Robert Garreau's 1990 book, A Deed of Death, gave some credence to the possibility of a hired killer, Mr. X, from out of state as the culprit, linking to narcotics revenge. But critics like Sidney Kirkpatrick, author of Cast of Killers, point out that this doesn't explain the subsequent cover-up. Why would Hollywood executives and Charlotte Shelby be scurrying to hide evidence if an outside gangster was responsible? Unless, of course, that outside man was hired by someone in Hollywood to settle a more personal score under the guise of a drug hit. In any case, while the drug angle remains part of the Taylor murder lore, most historians treat it as a red herring that conveniently tapped into the period's fear of crime syndicates and its awareness of Starr's drug problems. Homosexual blackmail, or love triangle gone wrong. Lurid stories in 1922 also floated the possibility that William Desmond Taylor was killed due to secrets in his personal life, specifically insinuating a homosexual motive. Taylor was a bachelor who kept his romantic life discreet. Aside from two actresses, there were whisperings that he might have had relationships with men. A particularly scandalous rumor, fanned by notorious writer Kenneth Anger in Hollywood Babylon, though that book is more fabloid than fact, spoke of a diary in which Taylor detailed trysts with male partners, and that someone perhaps was blackmailing him, leading to murder. Another rumor dragged in an occult angle, alleging Taylor and Mabel were involved in Aleister Crowley's satanic sex cult, and that the murder was a ritual or lover's quarrel tied to these activities. The Guardian notes these dark whisperings of sex perversion and occult intrigue as examples of how far the press went in creating sensational copy. In truth, there's no credible evidence Taylor was part of any occult, or that his private life was scandalous beyond an affair or two. But the press in 1922 didn't need evidence. The suggestion of homosexuality or deviant orgies was enough to sell papers. The blackmail theory, however, can't be entirely dismissed. Taylor's mysterious past, he had changed his name and left the family back east, and his position in the industry could have made him a target for extortion. If he was being extorted, one might theorize he confronted the extortionist and was shot. Still, not a shred of such a scenario surfaced in the official inquiries. Mistaken identity, a rather outlandish theory that occasionally gets mentioned, especially in retrospective indulging in hearsay, involves newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. The story goes that Hearst, who owned the papers stirring the Taylor scandal pot, may himself have been indirectly involved. The wildest version claims Hearst fatally shot Thomas H. Ince, another film producer, at a party aboard his yacht in late 1924, mistaking him for Charlie Chaplin, who he believed was dallying with Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies. That's a different Hollywood mystery, but conspiracy buffs link it to Taylor by alleging Hearst's newspaper hyped the Taylor case to distract from any investigation into the Ince incident. This theory is more historical mashup than plausible connection. Timeline issues aside, Taylor died in 1922, the Ince incident was in 1924. Hearst's coverage of Taylor's murder was voracious from day one, not just post-Ince. Another angle is that some speculated Hearst knew who killed Taylor, maybe from his powerful friends, and was blackmailing them for juicy stories. There's zero evidence for this. It underscores, however, how the Taylor mystery became a nexus for every conceivable Hollywood rumor, to the point that distinguishing fact from fiction is an endeavor worthy of a detective novel itself. In the final analysis, after reviewing suspects from the obvious to the bizarre, many researchers come back to the simplest explanation, that someone in Taylor's immediate circle with a strong motive, for example Charlotte Shelby, committed the deed and powerful forces helped to hush it up. Alternate theories, while fascinating, often require stacking assumptions on uncertainties. As a 2007 cold case compilation noted, numerous books have claimed to crack the case with this or that suspect, but no conclusive evidence has ever been uncovered to definitively solve it. Thus, the William Desmond Taylor murder retains its aura as Hollywood's original unsolved mystery, an open-ended story that invites each generation to impose its own interpretation. From 1920s moralists to 1960 Hollywood Babylon readers to modern true crime podcasters. Chapter 9: Scandal, Reform, and the Conservative Backlash. Taylor's murder did not happen in a vacuum. It was one eruption in a series of scandals that rocked Hollywood in the early 1920s. To better understand its impact, one must view it alongside the other sensational incidents of the era and the ensuing cultural backlash. The cumulative effect of these events was a turning point. Hollywood was forced to confront its image problem and institute reforms to survive. In many ways, Taylor's case was the final straw that convinced the industry to clean house before outraged middle America brought the hammer down. Consider the roster of Hollywood crises around this time, as even chronicled by contemporary observers. In addition to Taylor's murder in February 1922, there was the Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle manslaughter scandal in late 1921, the sudden death by poison of Olive Thomas in 1920. She was a star who accidentally drank a lethal mercury bichloride solution, believed to be for her husband's syphilis. Her demise in Paris was widely reported as a cautionary tale of flabber excess. The mysterious collapse and death of producer Thomas H. N.C. in 1924 after being on Hearst's yacht, surrounded by rumors, albeit likely from natural causes. In the drug-related decline of actors like Wallace Reed, who died January 1923 from morphine addiction, and Barbara Lamar, a vamp actress who died 1926, officially of tuberculosis and nephritis, but with widely rumored drug-alcohol factors. There was also the death of Jean Eagles, a film and stage actress in 1929, from a drug-induced overdose. Each of these incidents on its own was a PR nightmare. Together, they painted an image of Hollywood as a modern Gomorrah, decadent and lawless. The public outcry peaked after Taylor's murder. Newspapers across the country editorialized with venomous glee. Righteous columnists compared Hollywood to the Roman times of Caligula in an American Sodom and Gomorrah, urging that something be done. One paper thundered, "Destroy Hollywood," effectively calling for the shutdown of the entire industry. Others character assassinated Taylor in death, labeling him a crafty, cultured villain who got what was coming to him. Such pronouncements might seem histrionic, but they struck a chord with a segment of the public. Middle America, small town and church-going populations, was genuinely starting to turn against the movies. Attendance in some areas dipped as local clubs and pastors urged boycotts of films starring figures tainted by scandal. Arbuckle's films were indeed banned in many places, and he was effectively canceled long before the term existed. Politicians began proposing federal censorship laws again, and at least one state legislator suggested Hollywood be subject to military law to straighten it out. Hollywood's mogul read the writing on the wall. The hiring of Will H. Hayes in 1922 as the industry's frontman was the first major step. Hayes, a Presbyterian elder and former member of President Harding's cabinet, was seen as someone who could mollify the Blue Noses, as Hollywood folks nicknamed the moralists. Hayes went on a public relations offensive, promising that the studios would regulate themselves so government wouldn't have to. He imposed modest measures initially, such as banning Roscoe Arbuckle from the screen to placate public outrage despite Arbuckle's acquittal. Hayes also issued a list of don'ts and be carefuls for film content in 1927, a precursor to the later strict production code. Most importantly, studios began including morality clauses in talent contracts, giving them the right to fire actors and directors if they brought scandal or public hatred, contempt, scorn, or ridicule to the industry. The Universal Studios version explicitly defined moral turpitude in broad terms that basically meant any behavior that outrages public decency could end a career. These clauses were directly prompted by the string of scandals: Taylor's murder, Arbuckle's trial. Studios realized their investments in stars could be severely jeopardized by off-screen antics, so they tightened control. In effect, the star system from then on came with a leash. Actors were expected to maintain an image of propriety, at least in public, and could be banished if they stepped out of line. The Prohibition-era context also amplified the culture wars. The 1920s were paradoxical, a time of flappers, jazz, and breaking norms, but also one of intense conservative pushback. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had succeeded in banning alcohol, also often aligned with anti-Hollywood sentiments, seeing both booze and sex-laden movies as threats to the family. Hollywood's wild parties, plentiful liquor, and sexual freedom were an affront to these performers. The Taylor case gave such groups a perfect rallying point. Here was a scenario with booze. The case of bootleg gin carried out of Taylor's bungalow by a partygoer was a vivid detail in reports. Drugs via Mabel's rumored habits, and sex via Mary's letters and all the innuendos. It crystallized the vice performers' worst fears about the film colony. Interestingly, not everyone attacked Hollywood. There were also voices defending the industry, or at least urging perspective. Some publications pointed out that Hollywood was being scapegoated, that Arbuckle's guilt was far from clear, and that Taylor's murder was unsolved, implying it was unfair to convict all of Hollywood for these events. Even so, the negative press far outweighed the sympathetic. It took until the mid-1920s for the fervor to calm, aided by Hollywood's own efforts to self-police and a new crop of stars with cleaner images. Studios started emphasizing all-American wholesome types to counter the notion of the debauched film stars. One immediate effect of the scandals was the fall of certain careers and the rise of cautionary measures. Arbuckle, as noted, was banned from acting in U.S. films by Hayes, though he later directed under a pseudonym and was just making a small comeback by 1933 when he died. Mary Miles' mentor, though not banned, was quietly blacklisted by studios. No one wanted to court controversy by hiring her. Mabel Normand struggled to get her films released and was dropped by Sennett's studio a couple years later. Despite attempts at a comeback, her health and stigma impeded her. Even people tangentially involved saw impacts. For example, Mack Sennett, who had been a king of comedy, never fully recovered his studio's prestige after losing Arbuckle and Normand. By 1933, Sennett went bankrupt. Meanwhile, some new faces benefited from the desire for untainted stars. By the late 1920s, Hollywood's new it girl was Clara Bow, who ironically had her own scandals, but symbolized youthful modernity, and the industry as a whole emphasized glamour over notoriety. In 1930, the Motion Picture Production Code was written, though at first it was not strictly enforced. It wasn't until 1934, under pressure from Catholic groups threatening a national boycott, that Hollywood truly began rigidly censoring itself according to the code, banning excessive sexuality, crime without punishment, and more. By that time, the legacy of the early 20s scandals had been cemented in the form of institutionalized morality control. Hollywood was keen never to repeat the PR disasters of that period. It's noteworthy. that stars of the 1930s were contractually and closely monitored by studios. Reports were managed, arrests of actors were hushed up or spun, marriages were arranged to cover up improprieties, all as part of the machine to manufacture an image of decency. The myth of Hollywood as both a magical dream factory and a potential moral menace was born in the 1920s, and the Taylor case was a huge part of that mythos. Taylor's murder also had an interesting footnote in film history. It became material for films. One could argue it influenced storylines where murky pasts or blackmail appeared, reflecting Hollywood's anxiety about its own scandals. In the short term, a few thinly veiled references to Taylor popped up in movies and literature, indicating how infamous the case was. F. Scott Fitzgerald, for instance, alluded it in a 1920 story, and later we'll see other cultural references. The unsolved murder of William Desmond Taylor, combined with contemporaneous scandals, precipitated what one writer calls Hollywood's first great existential crisis. The industry realized it had to reform or perish. Through self-regulation, PR campaigns, and a bit of sacrificial lamb throwing, punishing or banishing the most notorious figures, Hollywood managed to weather the storm. By decade's end, ironically, the public's appetite for movie glamour returned stronger than ever, especially as the Depression hit. People sought escape. But the industry that emerged had permanently changed operating procedures to avoid another 1922-style reckoning. The pendulum had swung, illustrating how cultural pressure can force an entertainment empire to bend. Chapter 10: Myth and Legacy. In the many decades since 1922, the murder of William Desmond Taylor has attained an almost mythic status in Hollywood lore. As an unsolved mystery involving famous figures, it has proven irresistibly ripe for dramatization, speculation, and artistic reinterpretation. Each generation seems to rediscover the case and adapt its narrative to the zeitgeist, ensuring that Taylor's story remains alive in popular culture long after the principals have passed on. Let's explore how this case has been mythologized and referenced over time in fiction, film, and media. In the immediate aftermath, the Taylor murder permeated the public consciousness so deeply that it actually affected newspaper sale records. It was said that stories about the case sold more papers than ever before in the United States up to that point. This indicates how sensational and widely followed it was, almost like an early true crime blockbuster. Indeed, it was arguably the first American murder case with a bona fide Hollywood celebrity at its center. And that combination of fame and foul play captured people's imagination. It's not surprising, then, that writers soon wove references to it in their work. One of the earliest literary nods came from none other than F. Scott Fitzgerald. In his 1940s short story, Pat Hobby's Christmas Wish, Fitzgerald, who had been working in Hollywood in the 1930s, presents a down-and-out screenwriter character who stumbles upon a supposed confession to the Taylor murder by a producer and tries to use it for blackmail. The story, written in a comic tone, shows how by 1940, Taylor's murder was already a legendary anecdote. the kind of infamous unresolved mystery everyone in Hollywood knew about, and which could be casually used as a plot device. Fitzgerald's reference is also telling in that it assumes readers know the case. It had become part of the national lore. In the realm of cinema, the Taylor case indirectly influenced one of Hollywood's most acclaimed films, Sunset Boulevard, 1950. The screenwriters named the fated silent star character Norma Desmond as a deliberate mashup of the names Normand and Desmond for Mabel Normand and William Desmond Taylor. This was a subtle nod to the scandals of old Hollywood. Norma Desmond's backstory as an actress from that era, now living in reclusive delusion, evokes those turbulent times. The film doesn't depict the Taylor murder, but that choice of name hints that it lurks as part of Norma's milieu of bygone Hollywood drama. Another film, far less famous but directly inspired by the case, was Hollywood Story 1951, a noirish mystery produced by Universal. It was very transparently based on the Taylor murder. It centers on a 1920s director shot dead, the case never solved, and a modern-day producer trying to investigate it. They changed the names and details, but anyone familiar with the Taylor saga could recognize the parallels. The film even employed some real-life silent film veterans in small roles for authenticity. In the movie, unlike reality, the mystery is neatly solved. A fictional culprit is uncovered in a classic whodunit fashion. This resolution likely reflected the audience's desire for closure that real life hadn't provided. Interestingly, Hollywood Story was an attempt by the studio to capitalize on the success of Sunset Boulevard by mining actual Hollywood history. It shows that Taylor's case was considered marketable material. However, being a 1950s production under the code, it had to sanitize and simplify the story to avoid any real-life libel or salaciousness. The film's ending is purely made up. The 1960s saw a renewed fascination with silent era scandals, thanks in large part to Kenneth Anger's notorious book Hollywood Babylon, first published 1959 in French, then in English in 1965. Anger's book was a lurid, sensational compilation of old Hollywood gossip, and it devoted significant pages to the William Desmond Taylor murder. However, Anger's version was rife with inaccuracies and colorful embellishments. For example, he purported that Taylor had a secret life and suggested nearly everyone, Mabel, Mary, the valet, and more, as complicit in some debauchery. While Hollywood Babylon is not a reliable source, it had a huge cultural impact, cementing the popular image of the Taylor case as the granddaddy of Hollywood scandals, complete with sex, drugs, and mystery. It introduced the case to many in the general public who hadn't heard of it, ensuring its legend remains. In 1974, the Broadway musical Mac and Mabel debuted, dramatizing the turbulent romance of Mac Sennett and Mabel Normand. With that show, the Taylor murder is briefly referenced or alluded to. After all, it was a pivotal event in Mabel's life. The musical depicts how scandals, including Arbuckle and Taylor, derailed Mabel's career. One song even laments the end of the fun, saying Hollywood's innocence died. Though Mac and Mabel had a short run, it indicated that these old scandals were still considered compelling narrative fodder for stage and screen decades later. Moving into more recent years, interest in the Taylor case revived each time new material surfaced or anniversaries came. In the 1980s, two books brought fresh, if divergent, perspectives. A Cast of Killers, 1986, by Sidney D. Kirkpatrick, and A Deed of Death, 1990, by Robert Gurrow. Kirkpatrick's book reads almost like a detective novel. It follows director King Vidor's private investigation in the 1960s, which led him to conclude Charlotte Shelby was the killer, and a cover-up ensued. Though Kirkpatrick perhaps dramatized some of Vidor's findings and took a definitive stance, his book captured the public imagination and was a bestseller. It was even at one point optioned for a film. Gurrow's book, more scholarly, re-examined archives and leaned towards the less glamorous drug syndicate hit theory. The contrast between these two shows how open to interpretation the story remained. Both authors' work, however, kept the Taylor murder in bookstores, and by extension on coffee tables and in conversations. For example, after Kirkpatrick's book came out, there were TV specials and articles revisiting the old case, effectively inducting William Desmond Taylor into the pantheon of great unsolved mysteries, alongside the likes of Jack the Ripper and the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. True crime media of the 21st century also has embraced the tale. There have been podcast series such as Wondery's 2020 Murder in Hollywoodland, a multi-episode deep dive that dramatizes the events and explores the theory. The podcast format, with its love of serialized cold case examinations, is perfectly suited to a story like this, with its cast of characters and tantalizing clues. Online articles and YouTube videos proliferate. For instance, BuzzFeed Unsolved 2018 did a popular episode on the scandalous murder of William Desmond Taylor, introducing the story to younger audiences in an accessible way. On such platforms, the case is often presented as one of Hollywood's earliest true crime sagas, sometimes even dubbed Hollywood's first murder mystery. The mythologizing often focuses on the eeriness of an unsolved celebrity murder, and the contrast between the glamorous setting and the grim deed. It invites comparison to later Hollywood scandals, but because it's so far back in time, it also has the patina of golden age nostalgia that later cases, like the Black Dahlia in 1947 or the Manson-Tate murders in 1969, don't have. Taylor's murder is frequently lumped into the lore that includes Fatty Arbuckle case and the death of Peg Entwistle, an actress who jumped from the Hollywood sign in 1932. Cautionary tales of the darker side of Tinseltown dreams. In fiction, beyond Fitzgerald, other novelists have used the Taylor case as inspiration. For example, Gore Vidal's novel Hollywood 1990 features a fictionalized version of the murder as a subplot, weaving it into the political and social fabric of the 1920s story he tells. Novelists and screenwriter Samuel Peoples wrote The Man Who Died Twice, 1976, a roman à clef mystery clearly based on Taylor's case. Even mystery novelist Agatha Christie might have taken a passing inspiration. Her Hollywood-set short story, The Companion, involves a film director murdered with multiple suspects, though it was published in 1930 before the case was widely revisited. To this day, film historians and enthusiasts continue to discuss the case at events or online forums, often reevaluating primary evidence like the Taylorology newsletters compiled by Bruce Long. The case's persistence owes much to its storytelling elements: a charismatic victim with secrets, two actresses in love with him, a domineering mother, a city swirling with vice and virtue, and the ultimate kicker, no definitive conclusion. In a way, it's the perfect story because it has no ending. In mythic terms, William Desmond Taylor's murder has become a symbol. It represents the end of Hollywood's naive era and the beginnings of its awareness of image. It also symbolizes the theme of Hollywood Babylon, the idea that beneath the surface glitter of show business lies tragedy and sin. Whether that idea is fair or not, it has certainly fueled countless books and movies. As we conclude, we circle back to the man at the center of it, William Desmond Taylor. By all accounts, was a cultivated, gentle soul who loved the arts and embraced the adventure of life. He had flaws and complexities like anyone. In death, he became larger than life, a canvas onto which people have projected fears, fascinations, and theories. One contemporary writer in 1922 mused that this was the first murder where the public felt such personal interest because the players were familiar on the screen. That rings true. And fittingly, Taylor's saga has itself been played and replayed on the screen for popular imagination for a century now. The real Hollywood no longer bears much resemblance to the wild frontier of 1922. Yet, the legend of the Taylor murder endures, an unsolved riddle whispered about in studio lots, chronicled in histories of Los Angeles, and dramatized in media. It stands as an early example of our culture's endless appetite for true crime, especially when it brushes shoulder with fame. As long as Hollywood exists, shining bright and casting shadows, the story of William Desmond Taylor will be retold, a haunting part of filmdom's own origin myth.